All right, let's get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirupa Pushparaj, and I am part of Square's legal team, and I'm pleased to be here to offer this conversation around developments relating to COVID-19. So COVID-19 has created such havoc around the world to economies and to people's lives. And businesses in particular, especially small and medium-sized businesses such as yourselves, have a lot of issues to encounter, from being forced to shut down, shelter in place, and many such considerations. There are a lot of legal and regulatory developments around the world, around the country, at the federal level, at the state level, even at your city level, that you're required to be on top of, or at least be aware of, to be able to adapt to ever-evolving situations. So given this, and given the predicaments, Square is bringing this event together in support of merchants and business owners to discuss some of those legal ramifications and just awareness around that. To that effect, I'm pleased to introduce to you our presenters, talkers, co-hosts today. We have our trusted outside counsel, legal practitioners from law firms. First, we have Pankit Doshi, who is a partner at McDermott Will Emery, an international law firm, and he is a partner in the employment law division. And we also have Amanda Baker, who is a partner also in the banking and financing law division of Mayer Brown, another international law firm. Very pleased to have both of you, and thank you for offering your time today.
Thank you.
So we're all lawyers and we start with disclaimers. So let me start with this simple, quick disclaimer that this is something for the benefit of businesses like yourselves. It goes through global and broad overview of legal developments. It is not meant to be or to be construed as legal advice pertaining to specific situations. If you have any concerns that affect your personal situation, we still advise that you check in with your counsel. And that's all the disclaimer I'm going to give for today. And let's get started. So from the perspective of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to have two related topics, starting off with more of employment and workforce considerations as you encounter shelter in place and shutdowns, and as you move into more forward-thinking ideas of notions of opening up your business again, and how that's evolving. And from there, we'll shift over to some of the financial and economic stimulus or funding opportunities that are available for businesses in need, such as the PPP loans that you, I'm sure, heard of in much detail. And so we'll provide more background on that from a legal perspective. With that, I'd love to get started maybe on the employment side with Pankit. So Pankit, we're definitely in shelter in place here in Santa Clara where I live, and much of California, I think. But it seems to be an ever-evolving scale nationally, state-wise, who's in shelter in place, who's not. Can you throw some quick light around what's the situation now and how it's evolving?
Absolutely, and thanks, Kirupa, and happy to be here. I will say a picture says 1,000 words, and as of 2 weeks ago, at least 316 million people in at least 42 states in the country were urged to stay home in some form or fashion, whether it was a complete statewide order, or it was a recommendation, or there was some guidance. Now, the interesting thing about these shelter-in-place orders, as they're called, or stay-at-home orders or shutdown orders, is that while some states might have had certain restrictions or guidance, then you have cities that have either made them more strict or broadened them, and then other local ordinances that might have sort of shifted them again a little bit, all within the same state. But generally, while the orders varied, each of the shelter-in-place orders generally would say that they defined what an essential service business was and the essential services to be provided by those businesses. They generally required citizens to stay at home and to only go out for essential things like groceries and medicine. These orders also generally permitted those working in essential businesses to leave their homes for work. So if you're a healthcare provider, if you're a food and beverage provider, if you work in a grocery store, as we all know, based on our own individual experiences, you could then be out and about providing essential services. There was, of course, a lot of gray area, as there are with a lot of these ordinances and laws and regulations about what is an essential business. So, for example, food and beverage, yeah, you're typically an essential business to provide that sustenance to folks around the country. But what if you manufacture a label? What if you manufacture a bottle? Are you an essential service? Are you technically a food and beverage provider? Or are you a manufacturer? So there were a lot of gray areas surrounding those issues. Generally speaking, what a lot of businesses would do is if they felt in conjunction with legal counsel that they were an essential business, they would sort of lift out those requirements, set them forth. So if they were ever challenged by a governmental agency, they had what those requirements, their basis and justifications were. Now, as of just yesterday, this map that we'll show you right now shows that many states, almost half, have begun to lift their shutdown orders. And other states, as we've heard all over the news, are expected to follow soon. Just yesterday, California Governor Newsom announced that California would move to phase 2 of the state's 4-stage opening plan by Friday of this week. And essentially, stage 2 means that in California, retail, manufacturing, and other low-risk businesses could be open, but for curbside pickup only. And these businesses include clothing and books and music and toys and sporting goods and florists, just in time for Mother's Day. But those new guidelines, they're going to be released on Thursday in California, and then stores can start reopening on Friday. Now, the interesting thing there is, even with California going to phase 2, in the smaller sort of Bay Area where there are shelter-in-place orders, they continue to restrict these activities, and so the stricter orders will govern over the more broader orders until at least end of this month, when those stricter orders are in place until. And there's similar issues happening all over the country where a state might have broader orders, but cities or local municipalities might have even narrow orders, and you have to comply with the more stricter set of orders. And so, that's something that we're going to see. That's something that's going to continue to be monitored. We'll see more and more states start to open up. But as they do that, what are some of the considerations that businesses should be looking at when either they're doing essential services or they start looking at reopening guidelines? And we see certain patterns emerge from all the different jurisdictions around the country, whether it's, again, state or local. And there are, generally speaking, orders on social distancing, notice requirements, face coverings, and temperature checks. So looking at social distancing and notice issues, there are, for example, in the Bay Area, 6 counties that have updated their stay-at-home orders. Largely speaking, many social distancing orders have gone in effect in other jurisdictions. And we've listed out what those categories are here. If you're an essential business, you want to make sure to adhere, and you're open, you want to make sure that you adhere to these requirements, like having posters, limiting the amount of people that enter your facility, making sure that there's the 6 feet social distancing when somebody's in line, hand sanitizers, making sure that things are disinfected, and of course, when folks pay, that there are systems so that people don't have to touch the same objects as one another. We're also seeing that there are signs that are required to be posted at the entrances that inform employees and customers about, hey, don't enter if you have a cough or you have a fever. And again, we've listed out some of the requirements here that you can go back and look at for purposes of your businesses.
Now, are these requirements more at a California level, or do they change county by county? What's the advice there for business owners?
Sure. So what we've listed here is kind of a compilation, generally speaking, of what these requirements are across the board. These specific ones are focused. They've been taken from the California counties, but they're probably some of the more stricter requirements, and they generally comply with what other jurisdictions are doing as well. And
Okay.
and again, the reason this is important is if you're an essential business in operation or your business considering to reopen, these guidelines about signs being posted, following social distancing guidelines, those are going to be important, and you're going to have to adhere to some version of these guidelines. Similarly, face coverings. Now, that's a big issue. It's a big topic of discussion. Before the CDC said you don't have to have face cloth. Now the CDC recommends that everyone wear face cloth in public settings where social distancing measures are difficult to maintain. OSHA also has similar recommendations on face masks. Most states have some recommendations and some cities have their own. We've highlighted here the city of Los Angeles because they were one of the first cities or jurisdictions to specify not only that a mask is required for essential businesses, but also specifying that employers are to pay for those masks for the workers of essential businesses. And this ordinance requires residents to wear a face covering when visiting majority of essential businesses. It requires workers to wear these masks. And the trend that we'll likely see when the shutdown orders, as they slowly start to lift, is that this requirement of having face coverings is going to continue in some capacity. And we'll cover some more of that a little bit later.
And to a question from the audience as to whether we will email these slides out, yes, that's the intent. We'll share it. We're breezing through some of these finer points in the interest of time, but the slides and the handout will be available at the end of the presentation. So, Pankit, again, moving into some of the workforce and employment law considerations around both shelter in place and as we move into opening up businesses, what are some of the things that a business owner should be aware of? I know these are difficult topics to talk about, but what are the options here and how should one manage it?
Sure. So there are issues around layoffs that we know employers and businesses have to make some decisions on. There are some tough decisions about whether to do a furlough. Generally speaking, a layoff is it's letting somebody go, terminating them. Sometimes it can be temporary, whereas a furlough is more, it's a temporary unpaid leave from work. And there are certain issues if a business, your business, many have made the decision in March or April to engage in maybe one of these decision makings to save costs and to keep their businesses afloat. Some are, as was in the news recently, still engaging in layoffs or furloughs. If you are going to do either of these, you certainly want to make sure that you comply with federal and state WARN Act notice requirements. Some states have their own mini WARN, and what is WARN? It's a legal act that requires certain notice be provided to employees if they have to be let go for certain circumstances. Similarly, for furloughs, there's a few topics if you're considering furloughing employees. You want to make sure that that you understand furloughed employees are entitled to unemployment benefits depending on the state requirements. There is pandemic unemployment assistance, which is an additional $600 per week for employees who qualify. And then there are issues about employee callback and employee discrimination. So you want to make sure that if you do got to let folks go, unfortunately, that you do it in a way that's not discriminatory to any one particular protected group or ethnic category or gender. Now, what are the alternatives to engaging in furloughs or layoffs? And many companies are looking at, well, can we reduce the salaries on a temporary basis of our exempt employees? And you can, and if you do that, the main consideration is you certainly want to think about making sure that that salary that you reduce to doesn't fall below the salary requirement under federal and state law about what an exempt employee is supposed to have. For non-exempt employees, if you reduce their wages, you certainly, again, are entitled to do that. You want to make sure that you don't reduce the wages in a way that they get paid less than minimum wage. There are some questions about, well, if you do engage in these wage reductions, do you have to give notice? Depending on the jurisdiction, the state or federally, you may have to give some notice to employees that they're going to have a reduction in pay in advance and what that time frame will look like. There's also the alternative of doing work share programs. Work share programs, many states and jurisdictions around the country have these. And it's like having a temporary partial reduction in worker hours and wages. And if you participate in these work share programs, it allows you to temporarily reduce the hours of your employees, so you save some money. But those employees may still qualify for a percentage of unemployment benefits. There are state-specific rules on this, and we'll probably be saying this a lot, that each jurisdiction is different. WARN may be triggered, but a work share program is certainly something that you can consider as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely. There are people on the chat already talking about how things are different in Georgia and other places. Definitely something to take to heart, that this is very jurisdiction-based, perhaps even at the city level or county level. Moving from that into more forward-looking and hopefully better topics about what to expect as we gradually start to reopen. What should business owners think about and consider in terms of providing safety considerations and notices as they start to reopen?
Sure. And that's a great look. One of the biggest questions we're getting right now is exactly that, Kirupa, and that's, how do we transition to slowly as these orders get lifted? How do we transition, and what are the things that we should be thinking about right now for a remote workforce? One of the things you want to ensure if your workforce is working remotely is that they're accurately keeping their time. It's very easy to think you're working from home, and so I'm gonna send a text or an email at 9 p.m. at night, even though they're after hours. You don't want to be in a situation where you have off the clock considerations, or someone says they're working and didn't get paid for the time. There could be hidden work issues of whether an employer has knowledge that somebody's working, but they're not getting compensated in these examples that I'm talking about. And so the record keeping is going to be very important. The same is true for providing breaks. Different jurisdictions around the country have different requirements. You obviously can't monitor somebody who's working remotely whether they're taking breaks. You want to do your best to make sure that they're following your company's policies and that breaks are actually taking place and being reported. There's the issue of our business expenses being reimbursed. Somebody working from home, they need internet, or they need stronger internet. Maybe they need a dual monitor to be able to do that. Maybe they need a printer. Do you reimburse for those expenses? Are they entitled to that? Each jurisdiction, again, will have different considerations. Adjusted work schedule as well. You want to be mindful of the employees who might be unavailable during the day because they have some caretaking responsibilities now, but schools are closed. How do you accommodate their work schedules and be flexible and still comply with the law? From a minimum essential business operations perspective, multiple state orders offer an exception. So each state defines this differently, but generally it means, there are minimum necessary activities that can be maintained in order to keep a business afloat, like payroll, employee benefits. So you wanna take a look at to see if your business has some of these minimal business operations, likely does, so that those workers can continue to work and do what they have to do. And of course, one of the bigger questions that we're getting is, well, what if I'm operating, but it's in violation of the shutdown orders? I don't have the posters, I don't do the social distancing, I don't comply with some of the rules that are set forth. Um, each jurisdiction, again, is different on this, but a person or entity that knowingly violates the orders can be entitled to severe sanctions or penalties. In DC, it's as high as $1,000 fines that have already been issued, some suspension of your business license, possibly complete revocation of the business license as well. Other jurisdictions have initiated criminal charges as well.
Okay. Moving on, I know we're brushing through these topics, and we'll allocate time for questions at the very end, enough time to answer all these questions. Getting more into employee considerations, what are some of the benefits as to employees and things that employers should be aware of in terms of sick leave and paid sick leaves as it relates to COVID and beyond as you start to reopen?
Sure. So from the sick leave perspective, there's two sort of major considerations, and I'll just highlight that briefly in the interest of time. The first is the Families First Coronavirus Act that went into effect on April 1st. There was an Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act that required employers with 500 employees or less to provide employees, regardless of how long they've been employed, 2 weeks of paid sick leave, which is about 80 hours for the amount of hours that they would have worked over a 2-week period. There were specific criteria about who qualifies for that. So what does it mean if you're impacted by COVID in order to take advantage of this paid sick leave? And it meant, were you subject to some government isolation order? Did you have to take care of a kid as a result of COVID? There were a number of guidelines that were set. If so, you could potentially be entitled to sick leave. Similarly, under the same act, there was the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act, which provided 10 weeks of additional paid FMLA leave. It was only applicable to employers with 500 employees or less. And unlike the other act we talked about, a qualifying employee must have been employed for more than 30 days in order to qualify for this. And then,
sorry, in the interest of time, we'll come back to this topic because it's also related to question. But given that we have limited time, I'm going to jump over to PPP. But there's a question right along the lines of what you were starting to say, so I'll save that for questions, Pankit.
No problem.
Thank you. So again, in the interest of time, we're jumping over to an equally important and related topic, which is about funds and loans available in these dire times and how these are helpful to our to merchants and business owners. So Amanda, turning over to you, there's definitely a lot of talk about things like PPP and EIDLs and maybe even Main Street lending, which might not be applicable to this crowd here. So maybe we start with PPPs and EIDLs. What is it and what are the differences on a high level?
Sure. So PPP loans are really meant to cover payroll and other related expenses, and EIDL loans are economic injury disaster loans. So applicants can apply. You can apply for both a PPP as well as an EIDL, but you cannot use those funds for the same purpose. PPP loans are probably going to be more widely available, and that they can come from a variety of lenders, including Square, whereas an EIDL loan is really only authorized to be dispersed from an SBA lender. PPP loans are going to have more restrictions, which we'll get into in a minute, on what you can use those funds for, whereas EIDL loans can be more widely used. PPP loans can be larger in nature. They can go up to $10 million, whereas EIDL get capped at $2 million.
Okay. PPP is definitely the topic of the hour. Before we get into some of the mechanics here, on a broader level, I know we had the first round of funding, which may not have been catered to the small business owners as much as it was targeted for. And we had a recent second round of funding, and applications are at the moment being accepted. So what is the status right now of PPP loans? And what do you hear about maybe further rounds coming around for people who weren't able to get through this time?
Sure. So, you're exactly right. There was difficulty with the first round. We're hearing the second round's going a little better. I'm hearing that it's probably pretty likely that there will be a third round of PPP loans, and possibly even a fourth round. But that's definitely TBD.
But the second round is active and people are still applying and applications are going through.
Yes, that's my understanding, which is good news.
Which is good news. Maybe because it's a little slower because the loan amounts are a little smaller, considering it's going to the targeted audience this time. So let's see how it goes, but it is active as of the moment. So going again into PPP, maybe could you talk a little more about how a person applies and maybe practical tips around that and considerations that a business owner should be aware of?
Sure. So, it's really, these loans are meant to be targeted at small businesses. So people with businesses that are 500 people or fewer. The rules specifically say that this is meant to include nonprofits, sole proprietorship, self-employed individuals, as well as independent contractors as well. Go to the next page. Eligibility criteria generally is that either you have to operate your business in the U.S., which I'm guessing most of our listeners are doing, or if you're a foreign company, you need to make a significant contribution to the U.S. economy. The proceeds can only be used for domestic operations, and you basically need to be generally a good actor. You can't have any criminal history, parole, or probation or anything along those lines. The following businesses are generally eligible for loans, are ineligible for loans. I apologize. And those are businesses that are already engaged in financing or other activities. There's certain gambling companies, that are not eligible. And then any business that is engaged in some type of activity that is deemed to be illegal, whether it's under federal, state, or local law.
Okay. Now that I have a PPP loan, hopefully as a business owner, what can I use it for? And again, my consideration as a business owner is probably about making sure I maximize it for forgiveness. So A, what can I use it for? And two, if you could talk a little about what forgiveness means in this aspect on PPP loans and how I could maximize for that.
Sure. So different, from the EIDL PPP loans, there's a list of enumerated things that they can be used for. One is payroll costs, which can include certain employee benefits, any interest on a mortgage that you have, or rent, and for payment of utilities as well. And you want to make sure that you track that properly, because you will need to track it to make sure that you can apply for forgiveness. Borrowers can generally apply directly through an eligible lender. Most banks are going to be eligible lenders, and they are mostly conducting their application process online, which I'm hopeful makes things easier. Some banks are only accepting applications from current customers. Other banks and other lenders are generally, taking applications from the general public. When you're applying, you're going to need to make a handful of certifications. For a small business, these generally should not be difficult to make. When you're a larger business, when you have to worry about some affiliation and other trickier rules. But really, you just need to identify each owner of 20% or more of the company. Basically state that COVID-19 is the reason why you're experiencing some difficulty and are applying for this loan. That your business was in operation since February 15th of this year, and that your funds are generally going to be used, to retain workers and make your payroll and mortgage interest and rental payments, as I had discussed. And there are expected to be criminal and civil penalties if you're not using your funds properly, or if you in some way falsified your loan application.
Okay, and there's a number of questions right around that area, so maybe I'll quickly ask that. So where can I use these loans? Is it only for payment for existing employees who have been furloughed or just not working during these difficult times? Or can it be used towards rehire employees or new employees or contractors? Is there a distinction among these various categories?
Yes, there is a distinction. So, generally the rationale behind a PPP loan is that you are using it, one, to maintain your staff and also to maintain compensation levels. So to the extent that you let go any staff or, decrease compensation, then your forgiveness amount would be decreased. The rules, some of the guidance does say that, if you had let go an employee and if you made an effort to quickly rehire them, then that could count as an eligible forgiveness amount.
Quickly rehire them as tied to the PPP process, the application.
Yes, that's right. And then general contractors, unfortunately, if you're paying a general contractor from your business, that does not qualify as a payroll expense for a PPP loan. However, a general contractor herself could apply for a PPP loan.
Okay. Along those lines, just another quick question. How does unemployment insurance in PPP or even benefits in PPP kind of play a role? If I'm applying for unemployment benefits, am I, as a sole proprietor maybe, am I still eligible to get into PPP?
Well, I would think that would more be tied to, what you're doing with your business, if you're trying to keep your business up and running, if you're maintaining your staff.
And so it doesn't automatically negate it, is what you're saying?
Right.
Okay. Going into, again, and for all the folks asking questions, they're good questions. We'll get around to it at the end for sure. So supporting documentation and certifications, I guess, for PPP.
Yes. So I think this is important for applicants. Each lender is going to have its own set of guidelines of what they ask for you. Each lender has to be able to say that they did their diligence in dispersing the funds. But generally, if you're looking for a PPP loan, just come with some supporting evidence, tax forms, 1099, W-2s, any group health records, pension statements if you have other plans for your employees. You want to be able to make a colorable claim that you have an up and running business where you're paying your employees and you need this PPP loan to help facilitate that during the crisis.
Got it. So we'll come back to some more PPP questions, but quickly, can we talk about EIDL and how you've already talked about how it's different, but in terms of processing it and approaching it, what are some of the considerations?
Sure. So an EIDL loan, I would encourage for small businesses and nonprofits. But if you need money very quickly, the SBA under an EIDL loan you're automatically eligible for basically a $10,000 grant. So $10,000 that you don't have to pay back, to get you through a crunch. And even if you're ultimately denied an EIDL loan, if they decide that you're ineligible, you still don't have to pay back your $10,000. Got it.
Going back, can you share some of the details about the application process itself?
Yeah. The borrowers, it's a similar profile of borrower to a PPP loan.
Okay. And we'll share these details for whoever's interested. So,
and the application process is a little bit easier, hopefully, in that since only SBA lenders can disperse these funds, you just apply at the SBA website, which we have right here.
Got it. Thank you for breezing through those very difficult or complex topics in such a short time. So now we'll save the rest of the time for questions. I have a number of questions that people submitted during registration, and I'm seeing similar flavors of questions over here on the chat as well. So we'll go through as many as we can. Maybe we go back to you, Pankit. So a lot of questions I see are around, once I reopen as an employer, what are some of the considerations that I should be aware of? Can I subject my employees to require them to wear face masks, require them to subject them to screening or tests that I think are required for employment in my company or business? What are some of the considerations for an employer around these?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot, probably more than we have time for here, but the ones, Kirupa, that you mentioned are spot on. requiring face masks. There are probably more questions than answers on that. Some businesses may, especially those that come into contact with customers, may require face masks. If they do, the employer would have to reimburse for use of those face masks for the most part. Similarly, temperature screenings, it may not be required in all jurisdictions, but it may still be a best practice for a company to engage in temperature screenings before employees that come back to work. The other thing that employers need to think about is what if they have some employees that don't want to come back to work, or they can't come back to work because of COVID-19? Or what happens if somebody's diagnosed or thinks they have some symptoms? Are they still forced to come back to work? It's very jurisdiction specific, but those are a lot of issues that employers really need to think through. The largest being, of course, there are going to be many employees that say, I've been working remotely, I really don't want to come back. And what do you do in those scenarios? And the key there is you want to follow your company's policies and guidelines and update those policies if you haven't already.
Okay, segueing from there, it's a related question. I think there's flavors for both Amanda and you. For situations where I need the employee to be at my business and cannot work remotely and require this person, I've been either paying them through the PPP loans or continuing to have them employed. Now that shelter in place has been lifted, I require them to come back, but they are not able to come back because they are not ready to come back into the situation or whatever be the reason. To what extent can an employer force the situation? And if COVID is maintained as a reason for not being able to come back, what are some of the options from an employment law perspective that an employer has? And in a tangential question, Amanda, if I'm offering an opportunity for the person to come back and they have not come back and I have to lay them off, how does that impact my PPP loan? Is that something that I can still claim towards my forgiveness or not? So maybe we start with you, Pankit.
Sure. There are many considerations there. One, which we touched on earlier, was the FFCRA, paid sick leave. If somebody can't return back to work because they're taking care of a child due to COVID-19, they may be entitled to that paid sick leave that we talked about, and there's specific requirements there. If other employees don't want to come back to work for whatever reasons, directly or indirectly related to COVID-19, there's sort of what you can do legally, and then there's what you can do from a best practice perspective. And right now, it would behoove any business or company to sort of look at what are your best practices. Maybe you could force someone to come back. Maybe you could consider potentially letting them go as long as it's not it's for a legitimate business reason. But you really want to engage with the employees right now. There are legitimate concerns out there for employees. You want to work with them. If they have safety concerns, you want to be able to engage in a process with them to discuss what those concerns might be and try to alleviate some of them. And so I would say having a dialogue with the employees about what those concerns are would be important.
Okay. And from a PPP perspective, Amanda, does that make a difference as to letting go of an employee for these reasons and how it affects my forgiveness?
It's good. It's going to be tough on your forgiveness, given the duration that these loans are kind of open and available for, and the term of the loans too. I think, the intent's pretty clear that these are meant to, maintain your staff, your employees. So it would have a negative impact on your loan forgiveness. It doesn't mean that your loan was used for impermissible purposes. It's still a great loan. It's a 1% interest rate, but it would impact forgiveness.
Okay. Moving back to, again, opening up my business and having customers come in, to the extent someone's being diagnosed with COVID afterwards, an employee, what are my rights as a business owner pertaining to requiring continued information? And maybe if I wanted to do contact tracing, do I have a requirement to establish or initiate contact tracing? I know it's still evolving a situation, but as a business owner, is there any requirement on my part? And regardless, is it something I can try and enforce on my employees to have to report whatever contact tracing requirements I need?
And that's going to be a challenging one. So generally speaking, employers can't force employees to report symptoms and should be careful about implementing a requirement, but employees should be encouraged to report any COVID-related symptoms and positive diagnoses. Employers should communicate a policy of notifying employees if they had, they were in contact with somebody who might have had COVID, but employers should refrain from disclosing any of that information. Now, employers can require return to work certification from an employee before they return to the workplace, but part of it is going to be engaging in a dialogue with the employee on those issues.
Okay, and along those lines, again, one of the questions that came up continuously was, I had to furlough my employees for the duration, but then because the situation got so much worse, I have to close my business indefinitely or permanently in some situations. What are my obligations in terms of furloughed employees at this point, now that I cannot continue my business any longer?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things. So if, depending on the jurisdiction, and you're hearing that a lot, if somebody is furloughed and then goes from furlough to separation of employment, some jurisdictions might require certain wage obligations, like paying of final wages for any employee that is no longer in employment. You'll certainly want to make sure to give notice to those employees. And the biggest consideration is you'll want to let those employees know, or you'll want to endeavor to have a legitimate business reason for doing so in a way that's not discriminatory. So if there's a pool of employees that were furloughed, and then now there's a smaller pool that might be terminated, or even a larger pool, you want to make sure that there isn't a disparate impact on groups in a particular protected category like gender or race or ethnicity that might be impacted by that decision.
So the basic considerations still apply, but even more acutely so now.
That's right.
Thank you for that. In switching gears a little onto the PPP side of the world, one of the questions that keeps coming up, an easy one to start you off, Amanda, is if I qualify for PPP, am I ineligible for EIDLs? Was a question. I think it's already been answered among the chat folks, but do you want to take that on really quickly?
Yeah, sure. So you could apply for both a PPP and an EIDL loan. You just can't use that money for the same purpose. If, however, you already have an EIDL loan, say, and you're applying for a PPP loan, it's possible that your bank could kind of deduct amounts from your PPP loan based on your EIDL amount. So what we're recommending there is that you refinance your EIDL loan with a PPP loan, which would then just give you a larger PPP loan to work with.
Okay, so what you're saying is, if I already have an EIDL, is it the banks that automatically take out my EIDL loan out of my PPP proceeds, or is it more coming from the SBA? Is this something
It's a process that's going to be facilitated through whoever you choose to have your lender be.
Okay, so that becomes a strategic consideration then, whether you want to refinance and hope that the PPP is still available, or next round of funds becomes available, or risking some of that going away in the EIDL. Those are very important considerations. Thank you. There was a question of whether what the $100,000 compensation cap relates to, or how it impacts loans, if you want to take that on.
Sure. So for PPP and forgiveness purposes, there's a $100,000 cap per employee for their compensation. However, that cap only goes towards cash payments. It doesn't go to other cash payments, like if you have employee benefit plans or stock plans or healthcare, and other related non-cash ways to compensate your employees in place.
Got it. In another question along the same lines are, well, there's a lot of people talking about and considering things around, hey, how does this impact if I have contractors as opposed to full-time employees, or how is it about a part-time employee? And also about, okay, I paid for these employees, but after a while, you answered this question, I had to lay off folks or furlough them further. So how does this all come back in terms of forgiveness?
Sure. So, general contractors, well, those types of payments wouldn't be covered. They can apply for PPP loans themselves. They're one of the categories of borrowers who can apply for a PPP. In terms of part-time and seasonal workers, there is room in the rules to still pay them. And then finally, in terms of if you end up having to let go any employees or reduce salaries or do anything along those lines, that is going to then be counted against your forgiveness amount. You wouldn't be able to get forgiveness for those amounts. But like I said, it's a 1% loan, which is I know interest rates are low, but it's a 1% loan, which is still pretty good.
Okay. It's a flavor of the questions that's been asked. What if someone gets unemployment insurance because they're laid off? I don't think that should impact PPP loans at all, right? It's at that point, you've been laid off, so you cannot use any. Is there any relationship between unemployment insurance and PPP, I guess is the question.
Not to my knowledge, and intuitively, I agree with you. I don't think it sounds like they should be two interrelated concepts.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of the question around PPP, which is such a vague topic, obviously all of us are concerned about making sure the loans go through and the applications are approved and people are starting to get the funds. But once people get the funds, we enter this gray area, uncharted territory of forgiveness and what the tax implications are of PPP loans. If I get benefits from PPP, is that something that I don't get deduction benefit for my tax and all of that? So it's evolving law. What's your best kind of practical suggestion for how one could cope and start to prepare for that?
Sure. So from a tax standpoint, to your point, the IRS isn't going to let you double dip. So you're probably not going to, the IRS has come out and said you're not going to get any tax credits or deductions for these loans. But, to your point, this is all kind of still evolving. So just as a general housekeeping best practices type of approach, what we're recommending is just to keep careful track of how you spend your PPP loan proceeds. One, that it's within one of the permitted uses. Two, if it's used for payroll, then it's forgivable. And then also, for income tax purposes at the end of the year.
Cool. Well, we have, I think we got through most of the questions and we're definitely over the time here. We'll share the slides again for folks who are dialed in, and hopefully this answered most, if not all of your questions. But I think we need to stop the discussion at this point. I want to again extend a huge thank you to both our speakers today, Amanda and Pankit, for sharing so much of the information and spending your time with us. Thank you, and we're stopping the discussion at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.